For a woman once hounded from St. Croix in disgrace, Rachel exhibited remarkable resilience upon her return, as she ambled about Christiansted in a red or white skirt, her face shaded by a black silk sun hat. This handsome, self-reliant woman seems to have been fired by some inner need to vindicate herself and silence her critics. At this, she succeeded admirably, superseding James Hamilton as the family breadwinner. Already on August 1st, 1765, her wealthy brother-in-law James Leyden had bought her 6 walnut chairs with leather seats and agreed to foot the bill for her rent. Alexander later testified to Leyden's indispensable largesse, saying that his father's departure threw me upon the bounty of my mother's relations, some of whom were then wealthy. Rachel's return to St. Croix had probably been premised on the support from Anne and James Leyden, a hope that never quite panned out as her in-laws were themselves besieged by successive problems. As prominent sugar planters, the Leydens had enjoyed a leisurely life at the Grange, occupying a stone great house with polished wooden floors, lavoured blinds, panelled shutters, and chandeliers. Like many sugar plantations, it was a world in miniature, a compound that included slave quarters, a sugar mill, and a boiling house that produced molasses and brown sugar. Then one by one, the Leyden children were overtaken by the curse that seemed to afflict everyone around Alexander Hamilton. Several years later, Anne and James's second son, James Leyden Jr., had formed a partnership with one Robert Holliday. This business venture failed so abysmally that one summer night in 1764, the bankrupt James Jr. and his wife climbed aboard the family schooner, herded 22 stolen slaves on board, and cast off for the Carolinas. While the less quick-witted Holliday was captured and jailed for nearly 2 years. Shattered by the scandal, James and Anne Leyden sold the Grange in late 1765, moved back to Nevis just months after Rachel and her 2 boys arrived in St. Croix from there. Within 1 year, Anne Leyden was dead, leaving Rachel as the last surviving Fawcett. Rachel took a 2-story house on 34th Company Street, fast by the Anglican church and school. Adhering to a common town pattern, she lived with her 2 boys in the wooden upper floor, which had probably jutted over the street, while turning the lower stone floor into a shop selling foodstuffs to planters: salted fish, beef, pork, apples, butter, rice, and flour. It was uncommon in those days for a woman to be a shopkeeper, especially one so fetching and, at 36, still relatively young. One traveler to St. Croix remarked, "White women are not expected to do anything here except drink tea and coffee, eat, make calls, play cards, and at times sew a little." In her enclosed yard, Rachel kept a goat, probably to provide milk for her boys. She bought some of her merchandise from her landlord, while the rest came from 2 young New York merchants, David Beekman and Nicholas Cruiser, who had just inaugurated a trading firm that was to transform Hamilton's insecure, claustrophobic boyhood. No less than in Nevis, slavery was all-pervasive on St. Croix. It was the source from which every citizen obtains his daily bread and his wealth, concluded one contemporary account, with 12 blacks for every white. A decade later, a census ascertained that Company Street had 59 houses, with 187 whites and 427 slaves packed into breathless proximity. Since the neighborhood was zoned to incorporate free blacks and mulattoes, Alexander was exposed to a rich racial melange. Because her mother had died, Rachel now owned 5 adult female slaves and supplemented her income by hiring them out. The slaves also had 4 children. Rachel assigned a little boy named Ajax as a house slave to Alexander and another to James. This early exposure to the humanity of slaves may have a lasting impression on Hamilton, who would be conspicuous among the founding fathers for his fierce abolitionism. St. Croix had its picturesque side in the conical sugar mills, powered by windmills or mules that crushed the sugar cane with big rollers. During harvest time, the twilight glittered with fires from boiling houses that dotted the island. The coast around Christiansted was lined with soft green hills and punctuated by secluded inlets and coves. Early idealized prints of the town show 2 distinct moods: a smart military precision down the near fort and wharf, with heaps of sugar barrels ready for export, and a slow, more sensual inland atmosphere with black women balancing large bundles on their heads. Though house slaves donned shirts and skirts, it wasn't unusual for 100 or 200 slaves to toil naked in steaming fields beneath the towering sugar stocks. By night, the whitewashed town of Christiansted, laid out in a formal grid by the Danish authorities, erupted into a roaring, licentious bedlam of boisterous taverns, and open brothels overflowing with rebels, sailors, and outlaws from many countries. So extensive was the sexual contact between whites and blacks that the local church registers were thickly sprinkled with entries for illegitimate mulatto children. If Alexander Hamilton was exposed to abundant savagery and depravity, he also snatched distant glimpses of an elegant way of life that might have fostered a desire to be allied with the rich. The local atmosphere was not likely to breed a flaming populist. Poverty carried no dignity on a slave island. The big planters rode about in ornate carriages and shopped for imported watches, jewelry, and other European finery. Some oases of culture survived amid the barbarism. 2 dancing schools gave lessons on the minuet, while the Leeward Islands comedians served up a surprisingly varied fare of Shakespeare and Restoration comedy. Rachel tried to give her Spartan household a patina of civility. From a later inventory, we know that she had 6 silver spoons, 7 silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, 14 porcelain plates, 2 porcelain basins. To our saga, the upstairs living quarters held 34 books, the first unmistakable sign of Hamilton's omnivorous self-directed reading. Many people on St. Croix would have snickered at his bookish habits, making him feel freakish and contributing to an urgent need to flee the West Indies. From his first tentative forays in prose and verse, we can hazard an educated guess about the books that stocked his shelf. The poetry of Alexander Pope must have held an honored place, plus a French edition of Machiavelli's The Prince and Plutarch's Lives, rounded off by sermons and devotional tracts. If Hamilton left something stiflingly provincial about St. Croix, literature would certainly have transported him to a more exalted realm. The boy could be forgiven his escapist cravings. In late 1767, Rachel, 38, uprooted her family and hustled them down the block to 23rd Company Street. Then right after New Year's Day, she dragged them back to number 34 and succumbed to a raging fever. For a week, a woman named Anne McDougall tended Rachel before summoning a doctor hearing on February 17. By that point, Alexander, too, had contracted the unspecified disease. Dr. Hearing subjected mother and child to the medieval purgatives so popular in the 18th century medicine. Rachel had to endure an emetic and a medicinal herb called valerian, which expelled gas from the alimentary canal. Alexander submitted to bloodletting and an enema. Mother and son must have been joined in a horrid scene of vomiting, flatulence, and defecation as they lie side by side, in a feverish state, in the single upstairs bed. The delirious Alexander was probably writhing inches from his mother when she expired at 9 o'clock on the night of February 19. Notwithstanding the late hour, 5 agents from the probate court hastened to the scene and sequestered the property, sealing off 1 chamber, an attic, and 2 storage spaces in the yard. By the day of the funeral, Hamilton had regained sufficient strength to attend with his brother. The 2 dazed, forlorn boys surely made a pathetic sight. In a little more than 2 years, they had suffered their father's disappearance and their mother's death, reducing them to orphans and throwing them upon the mercy of friends, family, and community. The town judge gave James Jr. money to buy shoes for the funeral and bought black veils for both boys. Their landlord, Thomas Dipnall, donated white bread, eggs, and cakes for the mourners, while cousin Peter Lyden contributed 11 yards of black material to drape the coffin. As a divorced woman with 2 children conceived out of wedlock, Rachel was likely denied a burial at a nearby St. John's Anglican church. This may help to explain a mystifying ambivalence that Hamilton always felt about regular church attendance, despite a pronounced religious bent. The parish clerk officiated at a graveside ceremony at the Grange, the erstwhile Lytton estate outside of the Christiansted, where Rachel was laid to rest on a hillside beneath a grove of mahogany trees. There was to be no surcease from suffering for the 2 castaway boys, just a cascading series of crises. Heaps of bills poured in, including for the batch of medicine that had failed to save their mother. Less than a week after Rachel died, the probate officers again trooped to the house to appraise the estate. The moralistic tone of the report shows that Joanne Michael Lavian meditated further revenge against Rachel at the expense of her two illegitimate sons. The court decided that it had to consider three possible heirs: Peter Lavian, whose father had divorced Rachel for valid reasons according to the information obtained by the court, by the highest authority, and the legitimate James and Alexander, the obscene children born after the deceased person's divorce. The whole marital scandal was dredged up again, only now at an age when Alexander and his brother could fully fathom its meaning. At a probate hearing, Lavian brandished the 1759 divorce decree and lambasted Alexander and James as children born in whoredom, insisting that Peter merited the entire estate. Even though Peter hadn't set eyes on his mother for 18 years, life had not improved for the embedded Lavian, who had remained on a steep economic slide and served as a janitor of a Frederiksted hospital. His second wife had died just a month before Rachel. And the couple had already lost the two children they had together. For a year after his mother's death, Alexander was held in painful suspense by the probate court and perhaps absorbed the useful lesson that people who manipulate the law wield the power in society. While he was awaiting settlement of the small estate, principally Rachel's slaves and a stock of business supplies, the court auctioned off her personal effects. James Lydon considerately bought back for Alexander his trove of books. In light of Rachel's unhappy history with Lavian, the final court decision seems foreordained. Alexander and James Hamilton were disinherited, and the whole estate was awarded to Peter Lavian. In November 1769, no less implicably vengeful than his father, Peter Lavian returned to St. Croix and took possession of his small inheritance, an injustice that rankled Alexander for many years. Peter had fared sufficiently well in Beaufort, South Carolina, to be named a church warden, a chief financial and administrative officer in St. Helena's parish the previous year. Yet he didn't spare a penny for two destitute half-brothers, orphaned by his mother's death. One sidelight of Peter Lavian's return to St. Croix deserves attention because he did something shockingly and seemingly inexplicable for a 23-year-old church warden. He was quietly baptized. Why had he not been baptized before? One explanation is that Joanne Michael Lavian had painstakingly concealed his Jewish roots, but did not want his son baptized. Peter's furtive baptism, as if it were something shameful, suggests that he felt some extreme need for secrecy. After Rachel died, her sons were placed under the legal guardianship of their 32-year-old first cousin Peter Lydon. Already a widower, Peter had stumbled through a string of botched business dealings, including failed grocery stores in Christiansted. His brother later insisted that Peter was insane. Life as a ward of Peter Lydon proved yet another merciless education in the tawdry side of life for Alexander Hamilton. Lydon had a black mistress, Ledja, who had given birth to a mulatto boy with the impressive name of Don Alvarez de Velasco. On July 16, 1769, just when the Hamilton boys must have imagined that the fate couldn't dole out more horrors, Peter Lydon was found dead in his bed, soaked in a pool of blood. According to court records, he had committed suicide and either stabbed or shot himself to death. For the Hamilton boys, the sequel was equally mortifying. Peter had drafted a will that was provided for Ledja and their mulatto child, but didn't bother to acknowledge Alexander or James with even a token of bequest. When a crestfallen James Lydon appeared to claim his son's estate, he tried to aid the orphan boys but was stymied by legal obstacles resulting from the suicide. On August 12, 1769, less than 1 month after Peter's death, the heartbroken James Lydon died as well. 5 days earlier, he drafted a new will, which also made no provision for his nephews Alexander and James, who must have felt jinxed. Let us pause briefly to tally the grim catalogue of disasters that had befallen these two boys. Between 1765 and 1769, their father had vanished, their mother had died, their cousin and supposed protector had committed bloody suicide, and their aunt uncle, and grandmother had all died. James, 16, and Alexander, 14, were now left alone, largely friendless and penniless. At every step of their rootless, topsy-turvy existence, they had been surrounded by failed, broken, embittered people. Their short lives had been shadowed by a stupefying sequence of bankruptcies, marital separations, deaths, scandals, and disinheritance. Such repeated shocks must have stripped Alexander Hamilton of any sense that life was fair, that he existed in a benign universe, or that he could ever count on help from anyone. That this abominable childhood produced such a strong, productive, self-reliant human being that his fatherless adolescent could have ended up a founding father of a country he had not yet ever seen seems little short of miraculous, because he maintained perfect silence about his unspeakable past, never exploiting it to puff his later success. It was possible for his contemporaries to comprehend the exceptional nature of his personal triumph. What we know of Hamilton's childhood has been learned almost entirely during the past century. Peter Leyden's death marked a fork in the road for Alexander and James, who henceforth branched off on separate paths. The latter was apprenticed to an aging Christian-said carpenter, Thomas McNaughbony, which tells us much about his limited abilities. Most whites shied away from crafts such as carpentry, where they had to compete with mulattoes or even skilled slave labor. Had James shown any real promise or head for business, it is doubtful that we would have been relegated to manual work. By contrast, even before Peter Leyden's death, Alexander had begun to clerk for the mercantile house of Beekman and Cruiser, the New York traders who had supplied his mother with provisions. It was the first of countless times in Hamilton's life when his superior intelligence was spotted and rewarded by older, more experienced men. Before considering his commercial experience, we must ponder another startling enigma in Hamilton's boyhood. While James went off to train with the elderly carpenter Hamilton, in a dreamlike transition worthy of a Dickens novel, was whisked off to King Street, home of Thomas Stevens, a well-respected merchant, and his wife Anne. Of the few Stevens children, Edward, born a year before Alexander, became his closest friend, an intimate acquaintance begun in early youth, as Hamilton described their relationship. As they matured, they often seemed to display parallel personalities. Both were exceedingly quick and clever, disciplined and persevering, fluent in French, versed in classical history, outraged by slavery, and mesmerized by medicine. In future years, Edward Stevens was wont to remind Hamilton of those vows of eternal friendship which we have so often mutually exchanged, and he often fretted about Hamilton's delicate health. If their personalities exhibited unusual compatibility, their physical resemblance bordered on the uncanny, often stopping people cold. 30 years later, when Hamilton's close friend Timothy Pickering, then Secretary of State, set eyes on Edward Stevens, he was bowed over by the likeness. At the first glance, recalled Pickering, I was struck by the extraordinary similitude of his and General Hamilton's faces. I thought they must be brothers. When Pickering confided his amazement to the Stevens brother-in-law, James Yard of St. Croix, the latter informed me that the remark had been made 1,000 times. This mystery began to obsess the inquisitive Pickering, who finally concluded that Hamilton and Stephen were brothers. In notes assembled for a projected biography of Hamilton, Pickering wrote that it was generally understood that Hamilton was an illegitimate son of a gentleman of the name of Stevens. The scuttlebutt resonated through the 19th century, so that in 1882, Henry Cabot Lodge would write that every student of the period is familiar with the story, with oral tradition that handed down, that Hamilton was the illegitimate son of a rich West Indian planter or merchant, generally supposed to have been Mr. Stevens, the father of Hamilton's early friend and schoolfellow. What to make of this extraordinary speculation? No extant picture of Edward Stevens enables us to probe any family resemblance. Nevertheless, in the absence of direct proof, the notion that Alexander was the biological son of Thomas Stevens instead of James Hamilton would clarify many oddities in Hamilton's biography. It might identify one of the adulterous lovers who had so appalled Lavian that might identify he had hurled Rachel into prison. It would explain why Thomas Stevens sheltered Hamilton soon after Rachel's death but made no comparable gesture to his brother James. In the 18th century, illegitimate children frequently masqueraded as orphaned relatives of the lord or lady of the house, a polite fiction of understood and accepted by visitors. This parentage would also explain why Hamilton formed an infinitely more enduring bond with Edward Stevens than with his own brother. It might suggest why James Hamilton Sr. left his family behind, assumed no further responsibility for them, and took no evident delight in Alexander's later career. Most of all, it would account for the peculiar distance that later held Hamilton apart from both his father and his brother, as will be seen. Alexander Hamilton was an intensely loyal person endowed with a deep streak of family responsibility. There is something telltale about the way that his father and his brother relations abruptly lapse, as if the three of them were in headlong flight from some harrowing shared secret.